Well,
Most definitely.
you best be ready because I'm recording.
Wow, you didn't even tell me.
Well, now I'm telling you at like 2 seconds after I press the button.
A lot can happen in 2 seconds.
Tell me what can happen in 2 seconds.
You know.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of What Do the Gays Think? What's going on, Pat?
I'm ready to learn about a topic that you've researched.
A topic that I have researched, and I've done quite a bit of research on it.
Yes.
So today's episode, we're going to be discussing global warming.
Oh my god.
Very important topic, very relevant, and
Yeah.
probably going to be relevant for quite a while. So what do you think about global warming, Pat?
I think it's man-made. I think the planet is incrementally increasing its overall temperature, which will lead to changes in climate, such as worse winters, worse summers, more fires, more hurricanes. But you know what frightens me the most?
Tell me.
There was a paper I read a long time ago that was basically saying climate change obviously is terrible, but there's one facet of it that they were looking at specifically, which was when you change the climate of an area that normally has, let's say, a population of a pathogen of plants, because I study plants.
Mm-hmm.
If you change the climate, you are now going to change at what time of the year, at what frequency, and how severe you're going to get your crop diseases. Or you might get new crop diseases. Or, so someone makes a lot of like corn, some cash crop. Fungi love that like warm, humid, hot weather. So if you get a lot of that, more often than they normally do, you're going to have far more diseased plants. So this paper was looking at how climate change will affect what type of pathogens you see and where you see them and how severe they are. And that frightens me.
Oh, everything about this is very frightening. So I want the people listening and watching to come away with this from this session with a deeper understanding of what's happening, A, and B, why it's happening.
Yes.
Specifically for this session, we're going to be talking about what causes global warming, what's happening, why is it man-made, for example, and what we can do to prevent it. But I think we can do probably a couple sessions on this because I did want to get into like Joe Biden's plans, the Biden administration's plans for getting us to net zero emissions coming to 2050. But I just have a lot of information in general. When I started going into it and I started researching it, I started getting really into, what causes it and all of that. So I have a lot of information on that. So I don't think I have enough time to talk about what the Biden administration plans to do. So maybe we could do another episode on that.
Quick question, though.
Yeah.
Do you think that 2050 date is soon enough, or do we need it sooner?
It would be great. It would be, so the 2050 date is like the last resort, basically.
The last chance before our Earth is burned.
Yeah, so it's like the threshold that the scientists have set for us to be like, we need to get to this point by 2050 or we're fucked. So it would be fantastic if we could get to net zero carbon emissions before 2050.
Right.
Or just net zero emissions in general. I'll get to the difference between carbon emissions and some other things that we're emitting as well into the atmosphere. Because it's not just carbon.
No.
No, it's not just carbon that we're releasing to the atmosphere. It's a lot of other things too. Mm-hmm. All right. So we'll get right into it, I think. Dig deep into this information about climate change.
Well, for you, that would be about an inch, so it's not that deep.
Wow, way to call me out on our podcasts.
I thought about not saying it, but then I was like, well, he said dick deep. Like, this has to be fair game. Like,
God, trigger me, Jesus. All right, so all of the information that I have gathered about global warming comes from the NRDC, stands for the Natural Resources Defense Council. I did a media bias check on them just to see if they were a credible source to pull information from. And generally, people agree that they are left biased. And the reason that they were rated that way is because of environmental activism, which, of course, they're literally all about climate change. So they're going to have environmental activism. So that makes sense.
It's unavoidable.
It is unavoidable. For some reason, environmental activism is considered a partisan thing on the left when it shouldn't be. It should just be an agreed upon bipartisan thing. Anyway, but the NRDC is generally considered to be a credible source, even if they are left biased. So just going into that, prefacing where I'm gathering this information from, I'll also link to the NRDC's website in the description of the YouTube video or in the description of the Spotify episode.
Wow.
So let's get into it. Climate change. What is it, or what is global warming specifically? Because a lot of people, may not even know what is going on, and they might even know what global warming is.
I don't know what's going on. That's for sure. I have no idea.
So, over the past 50 years, the average global temperature has increased at the fastest rate in recorded history. And experts see the trend is accelerating, especially in the last decade or so. All but one of the 16 hottest years in recorded history that we have for 150 years or so has occurred since the year 2000. So obviously, the global temperature is accelerating at quite a fast pace.
Yes.
And for one thing, you said this before when you say that global warming is man-made. Now, regular global warming actually does happen. And there are lots of graphs, lots of plots. And maybe I'll put some of them up on the screen here for those watching on YouTube. But there are lots of graphs and lots of plots that show that in Earth's ancient history, for however many billions of years Earth has existed, there has been pretty drastic shifts in climate. So global warming actually naturally occurs. But the reasons for that are, questioned for why it happened in the past. But there have been periods in Earth's history where, there have been polar ice caps and when there haven't been polar ice caps. And, when the sea levels were really high and when the sea levels were really low. So global warming does happen naturally. But it never changes at the pace that we've seen it in the last 20 or so years. It always happens gradually over time and never this fast. And, I think one of the charts that I was looking at, humans actually started evolving during one of the hotter climate periods. But then, the polar ice caps formed and then human civilization started forming. So human civilization has only ever existed during a time when the polar ice caps existed. Even though Homo sapiens in general existed. Prior to that, Homo, yes.
Homo, yes.
Homo sapiens generally existed prior to that, but human civilization has only ever occurred during a time when the polar ice caps have existed.
Okay.
So here's where things start getting interesting. And first, the first thing I want to talk about actually is what are going to be the consequences of general warming of Earth.
Everything dies.
Everything dies, especially on human civilization and also on every other living thing on the planet. Yes. So consequences of global warming, before I get into why it even happens. Scientists generally agree that even a slight average temperature change is enough to cause dramatic transformation of the planet. And again, these dramatic shifts in the planet have occurred in the past, but never at this much of an accelerated rate. And never during a civilization period, like human civilization.
Right.
So currently, climate experts are projecting that the planet will be 8 degrees Fahrenheit warmer on average by the year 2100 should global warming continue on its current path. You may think, 8 degrees warmer Fahrenheit is not that much. But but it will have a lot of grave consequences, and we've already started seeing some of those consequences. And I'll get into those consequences for a second. But according to the National Climate Assessment, human influence are considered to be the number one cause of the current global warming period, especially carbon pollution. So you mentioned already some things that are consequences of climate change. You mentioned severe weather, which is one of them. What else do you think is a consequence of global warming besides that?
Rising sea levels, dry skin,
Dry skin.
frizzy hair, cooking omelets on the sidewalk, ears of corn spontaneously popping into popcorn. Wouldn't that be great?
Oh, well.
Let's just let the planet go so we can have popcorn whenever we want.
Oh, yeah, just put some kernels outside and then just let them pop. Yeah.
There you go.
Spontaneously. No, so there are a lot of different things that could potentially happen with a much warmer climate. You mentioned this one, increased severe weather. So higher temperatures are worsening disasters like hurricanes. It can cause heat waves, floods, droughts, wildfires, etc., worsening all of those things. One of the reasons that being, a warmer atmosphere can actually collect and retain more water. So that's causing more storms, and it can drop a lot more water, which is flooding places. But it's also causing like areas of the earth that have extreme weather, like deserts, to get even hotter. And areas that tend to get a lot of rain are getting more rain. So it's like exacerbating the current problems in certain areas. And again, for example, California, which has a lot of wildfires because, there can be droughts there a lot of the time. It's worsening that. There's a lot less rain there. And the hotter temperatures are making it easier for wildfires to happen.
And gender reveals, really.
Gender reveals, yeah.
Really contribute to those wildfires.
Humanity's stupidity in general is also contributing to the wildfires.
Yes.
So actually, if you look at the cost for the U.S. to deal with all of the damage from these extreme weather events, if you look over the course of the last, what was the time frame that they gave me? How dare they not show me the time frame? All right, it was like...
How dare you not remember? You researched this.
True. All right, it was like the last 30 years. I'm pretty sure they gave me 1980 to like 2015. The average cost of dealing with damage from extreme weather events was $5.2 billion per year, adjusted for inflation, back from 1980 to current day. But if you zero in between 2011 and 2015, the average cost increased to $10.8 billion per year.
Billions and billions.
So it basically doubled. The average basically doubled, which is crazy because extreme weather events are costing the U.S. more and more, but we're not doing anything to address it. And I thought the U.S. was all about money. I mean, come on. That's all they care about, right?
They care about spending money on the military and police forces.
Yeah, and the more we have to spend on extreme weather events means the less money that we can spend on those other things that we want to. So...
Don't worry, we'll just shoot the hurricanes. We'll shoot the hurricanes, we'll bomb the forests, it'll be fine.
Here we go. Also, warmer weather does have some environmental consequences, especially spreading diseases, because a warmer climate makes it easier for certain disease-carrying insects like mosquitoes, fleas, and ticks to spread across the country and, cause illnesses. So it helps spreading these illnesses. It also helps spreading, foodborne and waterborne illnesses as well, due to the increased weather. So now we're talking about increase in general diseases and illnesses across the planet too. What are some other consequences that I have here? Higher death rates, especially for low-income individuals where air conditioning is not affordable. So, we're talking about low-income individuals in the U.S. and also third world countries that may not have air conditioning. You're going to be talking about a lot more people dying because of the increased temperatures, especially with heat-related deaths.
Right.
Which actually in America, heat-related deaths kill more Americans per year than hurricanes, tornadoes, floods, and lightning combined.
Well, thank God they added in the lightning. I just need to say really quickly. I love how in the last episode, I'm like, a lot of these topics really bumming. Just like there's a lot of bad things happening in the world right now. It's unfortunate. And now this episode, you're like, everything's on fire, everything's dying, it's drowning, getting electrocuted, disease is everywhere.
Look, this is an important topic to talk about, though, because we need action. Yes. We need action on this.
Yes, you have to put the fear of God in them.
Yes. Once we understand why certain bad things are happening, then maybe we'll start taking some more action on certain things. Yeah. Some other bad things: dirtier air. So as we're polluting our air and our ozone layer is attaining all of this, disgusting smog and stuff. The hotter things get, the more smog that we get. So that's going to cause us dirtier air. And also airborne pollen will be increased due to the temperature. So a lot of people who have allergies or asthma will struggle a lot more as things progress. Higher wildlife extinction rates. As land and sea undergo rapid changes, animals that inhabit them are doomed to disappear if they don't adapt quickly enough. And, in the past, global warming occurred over a natural period of time. So these species had a longer period of time to adapt to the climate changes. But nowadays, these species don't have enough time to adapt to the rapid change of climate. So we're talking about a lot of species that are going to be disappearing a lot faster.
Yes, the natural selection, or should we say unnatural selection, that it's going through now is a lot different because as you said, the rate is accelerated. So while things normally progress under natural selection a lot more slowly and have time for those particular members of a population who can succeed, do succeed, none of the members have time to do that, and they all start dying.
Exactly. And it says here there was a 2015 study that showed that vertebrate species, which are any animals with like backbones, vertebrate species are disappearing 114 times faster than they should be, and this was linked to the increase in climate.
Increase in climate?
Increase in temperature, and also to deforestation.
Well, they just go hand in hand.
They do go hand in hand. Some other interesting ones that I saw, acidic oceans, because the oceans are absorbing a lot of the excess emissions that we're emitting. The oceans become more acidic. That poses a serious threat to underwater life, for one thing. It can also impact a lot of the fishing industries as well across the globe, as they're not going to be able to get as much profit from their crabs or their lobsters that they're trying to sell.
For someone who hates crabs and shellfish, you didn't think of like fish, like tuna, trout, salmon, whatever. You went right to crabs.
Well, yes, because I have a statistic on shellfish specifically.
Everything is becoming crabs.
Everything. No, let's not talk about how everything's becoming crabs. Everything's evolving into crabs. No, but I have a statistic here where it says that the Pacific Northwest oyster industry was cost nearly $110 million due to ocean acidification.
That's a lot of money.
Yep, and specifically in the U.S., coastal communities in 15 states that depend on the $1 billion nationwide annual harvest of certain shell fisheries are being impacted and face long-term economic risks due to ocean acidification. So there's that as well. Also, more acid rain. That's good.
Just when you thought it was safe to go back outside, acid rain.
Acid rain. And yeah, obviously you mentioned this one, but higher sea levels as well. As the polar ice caps are melting, we're talking about certain areas of the globe that are at a really low sea level could vanish by the year 2100. It's estimated that the oceans could be between 1 to 4 feet higher in 2100 if global warming continues at the rate in which it is occurring, and that impacts, some nations are entirely island nations. It definitely impacts those. Some of them could end up completely underwater. Yeah. Cities like New York, which have a really low sea level, you could see, possibly disappearing in the next century if we don't do something about the rising sea level. So lots of crazy things happening. And obviously there could be more consequences of global warming than the ones that I've just listed. But clearly, global warming is a problem, and it's affecting everything.
Yes.
So obviously it needs to be addressed, and we're going to address it at its source, Pat. We're going to address it at its source.
Oh my God, where does it all start?
Where does it all start? Glad you asked. What causes global warming? This is what it says in my notes. I have it split into section. This section is called What Causes Global Warming?
Yes.
Here we go. So global warming comes from something called the greenhouse effect, and you may have heard of this.
Yeah, science class, yeah.
Science class, yes. The greenhouse effect is actually a good thing because it keeps our planet warm. So the greenhouse effect is this natural warming of Earth that results when the gases in our atmosphere trap the heat from the sun within our atmosphere that would otherwise, escape into space. So like, when the sun radiates its lovely heat into our atmosphere, some of it bounces off our atmosphere immediately. Like, I think it says 30% of solar energy reflects back into space immediately off our atmosphere, but 70% gets through. And that heat is absorbed by, land, oceans, and the atmosphere. So when the heat bounces off basically the surface of the Earth and goes up back to the atmosphere, a lot of that is absorbed into the atmosphere. It says around 90% of that infrared light that bounces off is absorbed back into the atmosphere. And that warms our Earth, which is a good thing because it keeps the planet habitable. So generally, the greenhouse effect is a good thing as long as, it's not trapping all of the heat within.
Right.
Which could, increase our planet's rate, which is what we're seeing in terms of global warming. So basically, obviously, the more gas that is in our atmosphere, the more heat that gets trapped, and that causes extra warming to occur. So as long as there's extra gas, which we're emitting in tons of different ways into our atmosphere, that means the Earth is going to keep getting warmer. So that's generally what causes global warming. And I have some interesting statistics here. So it says for the past 800,000 years, which is much longer than human civilization, by the way.
Yes, I think it is.
Yeah, so the general concentration of these greenhouse gases that cause global warming in our atmosphere was, it says between 200 and 280 molecules per million molecules. So it's like that's the concentration. 200 out of a million molecules in the air.
Is that parts per million or?
Yeah, it's parts per million. I said molecules per million molecules because that made more sense to me. But yeah, parts per million is what it is.
Yeah. ppm.
ppm. So that's the general concentration of greenhouse gases. In the last century, this has increased to 400 parts per million. So it's basically doubled in the last century compared to the last 800,000 years.
Yes.
And generally, climate scientists agree that this is due to human activities, especially from the industrial era.
Yeah.
So you can already tell that we've doubled the amount of concentration of gas in our atmosphere. It definitely makes sense why, we're seeing this global warming effect and increased warming due to the greenhouse effect. So the main gases responsible for the greenhouse effect are carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, and water vapor. Well, at least those are the gases that all occur naturally, right? All of them occur naturally in our atmosphere. There's also fluorinated gases, which are man-made gases, which I can explain where fluorinated gases come from, but that didn't exist at all in our atmosphere prior to human activities. So those are the main five, actually. So there's carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, water vapor, and fluorinated gases. And this is where I started getting into it. I started going into each of these gases specifically to see their effects on global warming. We're going to get into that, but each of these gases have different properties, and they're removed from the atmosphere over time at different rate and via different processes. Carbon dioxide can be absorbed from the atmosphere into plants via photosynthesis or into the ocean. And some of these gases don't get destroyed by anything except for sunlight itself. Like the fluorinated gases, for example, don't get reabsorbed anywhere, and they are only destroyed by sunlight in the far upper part of the atmosphere, which makes it really difficult for these fluorinated gases to go away.
Yeah.
They just like stay in the atmosphere for a really long time, which is a problem because that causes a lot of global warming. So anyway, the NRDC tends to measure these gases based on three major factors and how they impact global warming. So those three major factors are concentration. We talked about that. How much of it is in the atmosphere, so ppm. There's also ppb and ppt, parts per billion and parts per trillion.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Second factor is lifetime, so how long does the gas stay in the atmosphere? And then there's global warming potential, also called GWP, which is the total energy that a gas absorbs over a period of time. And it's all relative to carbon dioxide. So carbon dioxide is like the baseline for GWP.
Right.
So a lot of these gases you'll see will have like 25 GWP, which is like 25 times the amount of energy that carbon dioxide would absorb in the atmosphere.
It's a reference, yeah.
It's a reference point, yeah. All right, so it is estimated that since the start of the Industrial Revolution, or from around 1750 to today, the atmospheric concentrations of carbon dioxide have increased by 40%. Methane has gone up by 150%.
Oh, good.
Nitrous oxide by 20%. And in the 1920s, we started adding those fluorinated gases into the mix as well.
Right.
So that increased infinitely because they, weren't even in the picture in the first place. So that 40% increase that I talked about with carbon dioxide, half of that 40% occurred in the last 40 years.
Oh.
So this is increasing
Yes.
over time at a exponential rate. And most of this is due to, burning fossil fuels and, other industrial processes that involve burning gases and fuels. So I want to show off some statistics for each of the different gases to explain their different effects that they have on global warming. I'll start with carbon because that's the most commonly known one, and everyone keeps saying, we have to reduce our carbon emissions, etc. So our emissions of carbon dioxide make up about 75%. It actually says 76% of all global human emissions. So it's most of it, right? 3/4 of human emissions come from emitting carbon dioxide. Now we talk about the lifetime, because I mentioned that's one of the factors that the NRDC measures by. 40% of carbon still remains in the atmosphere after 100 years. So it stays in the atmosphere for a pretty long time.
Yes.
And then it says 20% stays for 1,000 years. And 10% can last for up to 10,000 years.
Well, I'll be long dead by then.
That's true. But you understand the problem, right? Is that, the more carbon we emit into the atmosphere, a lot of it is not going to go away anytime soon, even in our lifetimes, which poses, this is a problem that's going to be perpetual and it's going to continue for thousands of years. And if we don't shut it down now, it's going to stay for a while.
Yes.
So carbon dioxide, massive problem, most of our emissions, but some of these other gases can actually have more impacts, even though there's less of it. So methane, which is 16% of global human emissions, so a lot less of our emissions, but it's still there. It only persists in the atmosphere for about 10 years, so its lifetime is a lot less.
Good.
So that's good. However, its GWP is 25. It absorbs 25 times more energy than CO2 does in a span of about 100 years.
Great.
So even though it's not as bad as in it doesn't persist as long in the atmosphere, it has a much more potent greenhouse effect.
Right.
So methane is also a problem on top of our carbon emissions, and it's also something that needs to be addressed. Nitrous oxide, which is 6% of human-caused emissions, has a lifetime of about 100 years in the atmosphere. Its GWP is around 300. So 300 times more heat is captured by nitrous oxide than CO2 in 100 years. So also a problem. Even though it's only 6% of our emissions, it's still a problem.
Yeah.
Fluorinated gases. These ones are interesting because they're man-made. There's a lot of different types of these fluorinated gases. There's hydrofluorocarbons. Those are called HFCs. Perfluorocarbons, sulfur hexafluoride, nitra trifluoride. There's a lot of these different ones. The main one are these HFCs. And they make up around 2% of human-caused emissions. So it's a relatively small amount. But their lifetimes can be up to tens of thousands of years because, they don't naturally get removed from the atmosphere by any natural process.
Yeah.
And their GWP can be from 1,000 to 10,000, like times more heat absorbed than carbon. So these are really bad gases, especially for our atmosphere. So these HFCs are actually mainly used in air conditioning systems and also refrigeration systems. So, your refrigerator, for example, will use HFCs to cool down everything in your refrigerator. And also your air conditioning might use HFCs to, cool down your air as well. Mm-hmm. The problem is that most of these HFCs get emitted into the atmosphere because they're not properly disposed of. So when you're replacing your air conditioning or you're replacing your refrigerator, if it's not disposed of properly, then all of that, bad stuff, the HFCs, can get emitted into the atmosphere. Huge problem.
Yeah.
Which is why one of the things that the NRDC actually says that, replacing HFCs is considered to be one of the most essential climate actions in the world, but also coming up with protocols to dispose of it properly is also considered to be one of the top priority actions for climate.
Right.
Is properly disposing of HFCs, which is crazy. There's something called the Montreal Protocol that they just recently amended very recently, and it says, by 2019, most high-income countries will phase out HFCs in favor of some other refrigerants. Right. But, it's still a problem that, a lot of our refrigerators are going to be hanging around. Like, even if we phase out HFCs for new refrigerators and new air conditioning units, we still have all these units across the globe that are still using HFCs. And when they die and we need to get them replaced, we need a proper way to dispose of them.
Yeah.
So that is considered to be one of the essential things that needs to be done, which is something I didn't know. Because, when you talk about global warming and, when you talk about this, when people are like, oh, we have to reduce our carbon emissions, we have to reduce this and that. Yeah. No one ever talks about, these HFCs and, these refrigeration units and these air conditioning units that need to be disposed of properly because it's actually really bad when you don't dispose of them properly.
You know why they don't talk about it then?
Why don't they talk about it?
Because it's not sexy. It's not, like, honestly though, it's not like you have to like make it sound more fun than that if people want to get involved. Because like if you say like, global warming, the average temperature increases due to gas emission, people can follow that pretty easily. But once you get into the specific types of gases, how they're produced, and then things like refrigerators or coolants or anything like that, people are going to be like, this is getting complicated.
Well, people need to understand the science behind it and understand why these things are happening.
Oh, of course they should.
Like the air conditioning unit in your car uses HFCs. Yes. Perhaps not for newer models of cars because they were supposed to have phased out HFC refrigerants in 2019 for high-income countries. Although I don't know if that happened in the U.S. because we pulled out of the Paris Climate Accord. I'm not sure. Oh. I should have looked, but we were supposed to phase them out in 2019.
Right.
I don't know what happened during the Trump administration. So.
Oh, I know what happened.
Oh,
a lot of bad shit.
I'll go through the last gas now. So the last gas is water vapor, right? This is actually the most abundant greenhouse gas overall, and it's not linked to human activities directly. It's because the changes in the atmospheric concentration of water vapor occurs as a result of the other greenhouse gas warming.
Oh,
So generally, warmer air can hold more water. So if the atmosphere is holding more water, that creates this like feedback loop of, oh, you know, the water vapor can absorb the heat, causing more warming, and that means the atmosphere can then hold more water. And then it's like this
okay.
crazy feedback loop that scientists generally see as a positive feedback loop. So the more heat that happens, the more water vapor the atmosphere can store, and it's this terrible loop of things that occur. And there's not much we can really do about it because, first of all, we don't know what the general impact of that feedback loop is, or scientists don't really know what the net impact of it will be on global warming. But generally, it's seen that if we decrease our emissions in all these other gases, we'll see less water vapor as well in the atmosphere.
Right.
So as long as we, get all of our other emissions down, water vapor will kind of follow along the way. So those are the 5 generally considered to be the most impactful greenhouse gases. And then the question becomes, where do greenhouse gases come from? So I'm going to scroll down to my next section. Once you start realizing, when you start looking at where these emissions are coming from, it's not coming just from, burning coal and whatever and burning gas. It comes from a lot of places. So completely cutting down our carbon emissions and all these other emissions is actually a pretty tough task. So this is why I'm curious about like what Biden's plans are to get us to net zero emissions by 2050, because there's a lot that needs to be done here. And once I explain that, you'll see how much needs to be done in order to get us there. So number 1, obviously burning coal, oil, and natural gas to produce electricity and heat accounts for about 25% of worldwide human-driven emissions. The largest single source is burning that for energy. In the U.S., it's actually the second largest driver. The first largest driver in the U.S. is actually transportation, which we can get into later. It's probably not for 2020. They haven't updated their stats for 2020. Back in 2017, which is where I'm pulling this data from, the largest driver was transportation.
Yeah.
But I'll get to that. Right, burning coal, oil, natural gases, that's the biggest problem worldwide. Second one, which is about another 25%, honestly, comes from agriculture and also land use activities like deforestation. So while it's 25% worldwide, in the U.S., it's only about 8% of our emissions, with that vast majority being in methane and in nitrous oxide. Those two gases obviously being a lot more potent and a lot more dangerous than carbon itself. Methane can come from, parts of farming where manure might decompose. And also, we talk about how if we have a lot of cows, when they pass gas and they belch, that also releases these
burps,
these bad gases, which is a real thing. I know people laugh at that, but that is a real thing.
Yeah, they found that the burps are actually more potent than the fart.
So, great, amazing.
Just so you know.
And that's where a lot of the methane comes from. And then a lot of the nitrous oxide can come from a lot of these fertilizers that use nitrogen. Right. So yeah, that's all with agriculture. But then there's also deforestation, which, as you take away a lot of the plants and the soil and, things that actually absorb carbon, if you remove them, it takes away from the amount of carbon that could be absorbed from the atmosphere.
Yeah.
So that's a problem in a lot of places. But in the U.S., we actually have a net carbon sink in the U.S., which means that generally our land activities represent a net less, like a net negative in terms of carbon emissions.
Right.
Which is a good thing because we're absorbing more carbon dioxide than we're emitting from these specific drivers, not from like burning gas and oil and stuff. Specifically from these land use activities, which is a good thing for the U.S., not so good in other places where deforestation is a bad thing. All right. About 20% of worldwide emissions come from in the industrial sector. Things like manufacturing cement and steel and other like goods and raw materials. Yes, cement and steel, like manufacturing this stuff.
Right.
Food processing, construction, like all this stuff contributes about 20% worldwide. In the US, it's 22.4%. As of 2017, it's mostly carbon dioxide. Number 4, transportation, which is 14% globally. But in the US, that's the largest driver. About 28.7% of the US emissions come from transportation. This comes from America. This is what the article literally said. Americans tend to buy larger cars,
Yes.
which is it burns more gas per year, which is interesting. We tend to take more flights. We have lower gas prices generally, which tend to encourage the use of cars more than other types of public transportation. So those are some of the couple of reasons why in the U.S. transportation has proven to be a higher problem. However, in the COVID year, obviously that might be impacted more. Well, we're probably not emitting as much for 2020 because, there were a few months where not a lot of people were traveling. Fine, right? And in terms of, what's being emitted by transportation, it's obviously mostly CO2. And it mostly comes from cars and trucks. More than 80% of these emissions come from cars and trucks. So if we started shifting to a more public transportation general system for the US, that could reduce a lot of those emissions. But of course, if you live in a place like New Jersey, where we live, a car is kind of necessary to get anywhere.
I technically could take public transportation from my house to where I work.
Right.
But it requires me to walk in excess of 2 miles, then take 2 trains. So it's a little cumbersome to do.
Yeah, it's pricey. And, compared to, driving your car back and forth in terms of gas price, the US gas price is so low that it probably makes more sense for you to drive your car.
Yeah.
But, it's contributing to the problem. But I think that's the US as a nation overall, the problem of what's going on. We need to be moving to electric cars over time.
Oh, I'd love to. But the problem is with that, we need better batteries.
We need better batteries, and also we need it to be less expensive because electric cars tend to be more expensive. Yeah. I recently moved to a hybrid car, so that my carbon emissions would be lower. But me as a person, right? Me as a single person, even though I decided to make that step, lots of people are buying trucks and, buying big cars that have increased carbon emissions. So it's kind of, and a lot of people are not thinking about them specifically, their car purchasing and, how much that's emitting. It's a problem in the US. Yeah. But anyway, I'll move on to a couple of other things. There's buildings. Yes, operating buildings generates about 6% of global greenhouse gases. And, that generally comes from burning natural gas for heat in the building. And, also those air conditioning units that get disposed of can release those fluorinated gases that are pretty bad. Mm-hmm. And then there's certain other processes that account for 10%. It's certain energy related things that don't come from burning fossil fuels. It's extraction, refining and processing, and the transportation of all these different things. Oil, gas, and coal can also increase emissions, like fracking, which is a process of extracting oil and gas. Yes, that does emit things as well.
Fracking.
We could talk about that in another episode.
Yeah, that's a whole other topic that I feel some kind of way about it.
Yes, that fracking is a whole other topic. Maybe we'll discuss that in a further episode. Yeah. But yes, it does increase our emissions as well. So there's that. Some other interesting statistics that I saw. Gas emissions by country. China is the current leader with about 27% of global emissions coming from them.
Yikes.
So yeah, they're a big problem. But the US is not great either because they're second on the list, coming in with 15% of all global emissions. Then, when you combine the entire European Union, including the UK, that's 10%.
Oh, okay.
Yep. Then India is about 7%. and then, yeah, it kind of trails off from there. But, most of those major powers that I just mentioned account for 60% of the total global emissions. So, the major nations make up most of the problem. China and the US being the top two, we need to start taking some action.
Yeah.
So the next section I have is actually some things that we can do to solve the greenhouse effect, ways that we can reduce it to decrease global warming. But did you have any questions about anything that I've said so far?
There is one thing, because I remember there was this, I don't know where I was having the discussion. The discussion was between, is it the individual's obligation to be as green as possible, or is it the obligation of, let's say, their federal government and corporations to kind of push for those things? Because there was this kind of notion that businesses were trying to push like the carbon footprint reduction and all that stuff, buying reusable products, onto the consumer. But on an individual consumer basis, our effect is minimal in comparison to what something like a corporation could do with massive changes to their policies.
Right.
Do you think it's fair that you have these groups trying to pass the buck onto people, and it's saying it's their obligation to change their behaviors to reduce their carbon footprint, when in fact those seem like it'll be doing the minimal amount of change to it?
I think it should be on both in a way.
Right.
Because when you do start breaking it down, in terms of like where everything is coming from, the individual consumer, being the people who drive the cars, we need to be moving to probably electric cars, if you ask me. Being that transportation is the biggest problem in the U.S. in terms of our emissions, I do think that the consumer generally needs to start moving towards electric cars, but like corporations need to make that affordable. We need to be pushing that agenda from the government. Like, a regular consumer is not going to be just like, oh, I need to change my car to electric, obviously. Like, no, well. So I think kind of partly, yes, the consumer needs to worry about it, but a lot of the emissions that come from burning coal and stuff, oil and natural gas, that does come from a lot of the corporations. So they also need to be worrying about it. And, just generally corporations need to start making, renewable energy sources more affordable, more accessible. We need to be, researching how to shift from burning fossil fuels away from, towards the renewable energy sources. Like the corporations have, they have a role to play, and they have a very important role to play. So it can't just be on the consumer, but I think everyone kind of needs to take part in it.
Yes, everyone's got to save the planet.
Yeah, everyone does. And yes, okay, so if me as an individual person moved to solar panels and, an electric car, maybe me as an individual doesn't impact the climate change specifically, but as kind of like a group effort, if everyone kind of came together and said, okay, we're going to start moving, in this direction, then I think that will have more of an impact.
Is that like voting?
Oh,
like where every vote counts if everyone does vote?
Yeah, if everyone comes together and agrees we're going to vote, then that's going to have a lasting impact.
Right. Wow. Lessons to be learned, people.
Lessons to be learned. We're at 48 minutes, so I'm going to wrap up some things that we can do. I already mentioned moving towards, these more energy efficient solutions, and also, changing to renewable energy sources. We can go air, water, solar energy, and move away from burning fossil fuels. That will be a really good contributor. Some of the other things that I'm seeing, we must decrease greenhouse gas pollutions by 45% by 2030, is what the IPCC said in 2010. So that was about 10 years ago that we needed to decrease by 45%. Who knows where we are now? And we must reach net zero emissions by 2050 to prevent global warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius. Which is
Celsius now.
Yes, I'm moving to Celsius because that's the world's kind of agreement that if we surpass 1.5 degrees Celsius, that's like the threshold that was identified to prevent most climate disasters.
And Celsius is scary because 1 degree Celsius difference is a difference.
It is a difference.
Yeah.
So right, I mentioned we have to start replacing some of this fossil fuel energy with clean renewable solutions, investing in more fuel efficient solutions, and electric vehicles. I obviously mentioned that. We need to protect our forests because they're pulling carbon out of the atmosphere. Reduce our waste, be able to, stop those fluorinated gases from getting into the atmosphere. We need to plant more forests. We need to grow new forests. The more plants we have, the better, because it's going to pull more of that carbon out of the atmosphere.
Mm-hmm.
And it's generally agreed upon within the climate community that we need very aggressive action at this point in order to reach that net zero by 2050. So I'm very interested to see what the Biden administration is planning in terms of their climate action. I know they have some. I think they have some of their plan laid out online that people can go look at. I didn't look at it yet because this is already a lot of information, and we're at 50 minutes.
Yes.
So I think we could do a part 2 here and
specifically go over that.
Specifically go over Biden's plan to get us to the net zero emissions. But I think it was important to understand what is driving climate change. All the different drivers. Where it's coming from, what's the science behind it, and yes, it is proven that this is happening, so it's not a hoax.
Oh God, right, yeah, because because some people don't believe it. Oh my God, right.
And yes, a lot of people are saying like, oh, it's a Chinese created hoax, and like, yeah, China's a big part of why it's happening because they're more than a quarter of the emissions, but the U.S. is not great too. So like we have to take global action, not just the U.S. action, global action.
Yeah, I mean, it's good when Joe Biden says it's like a threat to humanity. He got to get everyone involved because it's going to affect all of us everywhere.
Yeah, it's absolutely a human threat, and I listed a whole bunch of the consequences in the beginning of the episode, but if you want to go back and re-listen to the consequences, this is important.
Right.
And that's why I wanted to do this episode, because it's an important topic and we need to understand why it's important and what action we need to take to get there. So there we are.
Yeah, I mean, it's terrifying. You've scared me. I'm sweating.
Are you sweating?
Yeah, well, global temperatures have increased, if you hadn't noticed, so I'm sweating from it. Educated, afraid, scared, sweating, all the things.
Well, thank you to the NRDC for putting out all that information for me to extract.
Every time you say NRDC, I think of NRA.
Oh, no, not the NRA.
Yeah, I don't know why. It just jumps to that.
Maybe we can do an episode on gun control, but
fine.
Fine. Well, we'll see about that. We'll see if we really care. Anyway, let's wrap up. Do you have any other final thoughts on this?
Yeah, so there's one type of like renewable source that people want to do, and it's plant-based. So what you do is you get these I think one of them is switchgrass, I can't remember, but basically there are these types of grasses that they grow. It's low input, so you kind of grow them anywhere.
Mm-hmm.
And they get to large biomass, so the grasses get very big. And you can just harvest all of it and basically kind of process it and make these pellets out of it, which you can then ignite and burn to produce heat energy. That if you have a contraption that can, use that heat energy to do whatever process you're trying to do, you can use that as a renewable energy source because it's plant-based and it doesn't have as many emissions as something like oil or, coal or whatever.
Interesting.
So,
but does that still produce emissions in general, though?
Yeah, it still does. Some of them still do. It's just reduce the amount that you normally get with those other types of fuels. So I always see these like papers or like presentations about, we just gotta like grow a bunch of this grass, and it's really cool, I will say. And I hope there's a way that they can get this to work. The problem is you need a lot of it to get these pellets from it. And then you need a machine or contraption that is efficient at utilizing every bit of the energy produced from the pellet, because a lot of it just gets wasted as heat. So if they can kind of, because it's low input, so you can grow it anywhere, grow on the side of the road, doesn't matter.
Right.
If you can just kind of streamline the process, make it more efficient, then you do have other types of energy sources that are not coal or carbon oil based.
Nice. Well, I'd be interested to see where that goes and if that's part of Biden's plan.
Maybe.
It could be. I'm not sure. I really need to look into what his climate plan is. I know he wants to get us to net zero emissions by 2050, and he has a plan to do so. So I'll be interested to look into that. Anyway, let's go ahead and sign off. Thanks everyone for watching / listening. I'm Matt Glubeck.
And I'm the hole in the ozone layer, Patrick.
Great. Thanks everyone for listening.
See you later.